The year 2022 began with a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the world watched in horror. The United States, under President Biden, responded swiftly. Military aid flowed into Ukraine, and sanctions crippled the Russian economy. The U.S. stood firm in its support of Ukraine's sovereignty. It was a moment of unity and resolve. The U.S. and Ukraine appeared to be strong allies, bound by a shared commitment to democracy and freedom. Both Democrats and Republicans condemned Russia's aggression and rallied behind President Biden's handling of the crisis. The U.S. provided billions of dollars in military and humanitarian assistance. The goal was to help Ukraine defend itself against the Russian invasion. The U.S. also led international efforts to isolate Russia diplomatically and economically. The Biden administration imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, targeting key sectors of the Russian economy. The U.S. worked closely with its European allies to coordinate a unified response. President Biden rallied the international community, condemning Russia's actions in the strongest possible terms. He called for a united front against Russian aggression. The U.S. worked tirelessly to provide Ukraine with diplomatic support, helping Ukraine make its case on the world stage. This initial phase of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship was one of strong solidarity and unwavering support. As 2023 unfolded, the initial unity and resolve that characterized the U.S. response to the Ukraine crisis began to show signs of strain. The conflict in Ukraine settled into a grinding war of attrition, and public support for the U.S. extensive involvement began to waver. Questions arose about the long-term costs and implications of American support for Ukraine. The U.S. found itself increasingly drawn into the conflict, and the initial hope for a quick resolution faded. The deepening U.S. involvement in the conflict brought with it a host of challenges. The Biden administration faced growing pressure from Congress to provide more details about its strategy in Ukraine. Lawmakers demanded greater transparency on how U.S. taxpayer dollars were being spent. There were also concerns about the risk of escalation, with some fearing that the U.S. continued support for Ukraine could lead to a wider conflict with Russia. Within the U.S., political divisions over the war in Ukraine started to deepen. Republicans, particularly those aligned with former President Trump, became increasingly vocal in their criticism of the Biden administration's handling of the conflict. They argued that the U.S. was providing Ukraine with a blank check and questioned the wisdom of sending billions of dollars in aid while neglecting domestic priorities. This growing partisan divide further complicated the U.S. ability to formulate a consistent and effective Ukraine policy. The Biden administration faced a delicate balancing act, maintaining support for Ukraine while addressing domestic concerns about the costs and risks of continued involvement. The administration argued that supporting Ukraine was essential for defending democracy and deterring further Russian aggression. They stressed the need to hold Russia accountable for its actions. However, the growing political divisions within the U.S. signaled a potential shift in the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. The road ahead was becoming increasingly uncertain. The year 2024 saw a resurgence of Donald Trump's influence on the Republican Party. This had significant implications for the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. Trump had long been critical of U.S. support for Ukraine, having even withheld military aid during his presidency. His return cast a long shadow over U.S. policy towards Ukraine. Trump's rhetoric sowed division within the U.S. and emboldened Russia. The Biden administration found itself increasingly on the defensive, having to justify its policies amid mounting criticism. The future of the alliance seemed less certain than ever. By early 2025, the U.S.-Ukraine relationship had reached a crisis point. The once strong alliance forged in the crucible of the 2022 Russian invasion was now fraying under the weight of domestic political pressures and escalating tensions. Trump's criticism of Zelenskyy and his influence within the Republican Party cast a long shadow over the relationship. A high-stakes meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy at the White House quickly devolved into a public spectacle. Trump accused Zelenskyy of being a dictator, while Zelenskyy accused Trump of spreading disinformation. The relationship continued to deteriorate, with Trump's rhetoric growing increasingly bellicose. He accused Zelenskyy of using the war to enrich himself and threatened to cut off all U.S. aid. The future of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship seemed to hang in the balance. The U.S.-Ukraine relationship seemed to hang in the balance with profound implications for the war in Ukraine and the broader geopolitical landscape.